I'm joined now by data-driven journalist, writer of the Strength in Numbers newsletter, Elliot Morris. Elliot, thanks for joining me.
Hey, thanks, Brian.
So we have some major news here with regard to Donald Trump's approval rating. Can you speak about the new update we've just gotten?
Sure. Well, so last week the big survey came out as the new Pew Research Center survey. Now, the Pew Research Centers, they're a non-profit public polling firm based out of Washington, D.C. Their job is to come to the best possible measurements of public opinion in America on timely topics. So it's a neutral source. That's the big takeaway here on how Pew works. Their new survey last week, they find Donald Trump slipping to a 38% approval rating overall. That's among all American adults, so it includes voters and non-voters. That's down from 47% at the beginning of Donald Trump's term. So it's an all-time low for them. And then in our average of polls, so Pew and other polls, you don't have to take Pew at their word, Trump is also at an all-time low for his second term.
What about with young people? Because I know that was a particular focus of this poll where the results weren't exactly in line with the rest of the results.
Yeah, so young people, they were a big story of the 2024 election. You'll remember young people, those are voters under 30. They supported Joe Biden by nearly 30 points in the 2020 election. By 2024, they had moved about 20 points towards Republicans. They barely supported Kamala Harris in that election. So this is a group that you want to look at because they're important, they're big, and they're moving to the right. So among the young people who supported Donald Trump, Pew finds that just 69% of them support of the job that Trump is doing as president today. So you might say Trump has lost 30% of the young voters that voted for him. These are Trump supporting young people. Only a little less than 3/4 of them still are on his side.
So does it seem like these folks who moved, these cohorts, these demographic groups that moved toward Donald Trump in 2024, it would suggest then that these are not necessarily tried and true Republicans, that it's that their support for him may seemingly have just been temporary, and that they're not necessarily Republican voters who are going to vote for Republicans in the future, certainly not if they disapprove of the job that he and his party are doing.
Yeah, so a lot of the Trump voters, I might say, that were young people in 2024, but were Biden voters in 2020, they're not Republicans. They might vote for Republicans, but they don't identify as strong Republicans. They might not be firmly in that camp in the next election. We think that for a couple of reasons. First, on policy preferences, they're not conservative. They favor a lot of wealth distribution. In particular, they favor high taxes on wealthy people, and they are also opposed to a lot of the action in the Middle East, especially in Israel and Gaza. So that's not necessarily a conservative policy package. It's not the policy package of Donald Trump. On some of the particular issues of Trump's presidency as well, in Pew's survey, overall, Trump is underwater, and he's even more underwater with young people. So, for example, 61% oppose of the tariffs that he's putting into place. And the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, that's the Republican budget that passed last month, that's underwater by 14 points. And it's underwater with young people, too. So they're not Republicans. They're not Trumpers. I think that they voted for Donald Trump in 2024 because inflation was bad and economic mobility was really poor. That means that, hey, if inflation goes back up for Trump, they'll swing back the other direction.
Well, the latest polling that I had seen on inflation was that Trump's numbers on inflation are virtually tied with Joe Biden's lowest point on inflation when he was president, numbers that were so bad that it pushed virtually the entire country, including those young people that you're talking about, over to Trump.
Yeah, that's right. And we did an analysis of this on the newsletter, Strength in Numbers. So in peak inflation in Joe Biden's term, that's late 2022 to early 2023. Joe Biden had a minus 28 to minus 22. There's some noise. Approval rating among all adults. So 60% of people are saying they disapprove of how he's doing, and 30% are saying they approve. That's pretty terrible. And it makes sense why he was eventually forced out of running for re-election. So minus 22 to minus 28. And Trump is at minus 27 today. So his approval rating on the economy, on inflation and jobs is as bad as Joe Biden's was during peak inflation. And that's just to say, this is still an anchor around the president's neck, even though we've switched parties in control of the White House.
How are you thinking about the broader economic numbers in terms of our sprint toward 2026 here?
Yeah, well, look, it looks like inflation is resurging. There's the new producer price index numbers that came out last week. There will be new CPI numbers out soon, and they showed a resurgence in inflation, ticking up to nearly 3% at an annualized rate. For context, the Fed, the Federal Reserve, likes to keep that around 2%, and we were getting close to 2%, and now it's going back up. So that makes sense. Like tariffs are a tax on consumers. Businesses get charged money by the government. They have to make up that money somehow so that the business doesn't lose money. We're the ones that pay for that. So, it is an inflationary policy. It looks like inflation will start heading up as more companies have to price in those tariffs and pass the costs along to consumers, or they would go out of business. And hey, for the record, like Donald Trump keeps increasing the tariff rate. He's not turning around here in the face of rising inflation and a softening job market. We saw, uh, 45,000 jobs were gained between May and July, which is near all-time low for a 3-month period. Uh, America lost 37,000 manufacturing jobs since April, the exact industry that Trump says he's trying to shore up. So, weakening job market, increasing inflation, I imagine that's going to be a pretty big draw on Trump's approval rating.
Well, I'm curious how this presents itself with Americans, because in the lead up to the 2024 election, you saw a very aligned, coordinated right-wing media ecosystem exploit the every time eggs went up by one single penny. Like, they are very good at being coordinated, echoing their messages, and making sure that they're promoting all of this stuff because it would help their political agenda. The left does not have a coordinated media ecosystem. The left is not putting hundreds of millions of dollars behind telling you that eggs have gone up two pennies, or that rent is too high, housing is too high, groceries are too high, which was the case in the 2024 election. And so they were getting hit over the head with a lot of this political advertising in the lead up to the 2024 election. And we're not seeing the same thing, partially because we don't have, that kind of an ecosystem, and partially because there's so much other shit going on. We've got troops deployed, we've got the Epstein stuff, we've got the maps being gerrymandered. And so there's so much to talk about that costs going up, and this 3.3% inflation rate kind of feels like the 5th biggest or 8th biggest or 10th biggest story in America right now. But I'm curious whether that is still presenting itself, if Americans are still feeling the effects of that inflation, even if they're not being hit over the head with it by political advertising in very much the same way that Republicans were able to do in the lead up to the previous election.
Yeah, so the political scientist in me, I guess, wants to say that like voters feel the prices regardless of the signals that they get from the media ecosystem. But
Yeah.
and I think your analysis of the media ecosystem is spot on. As you raised, like there is an asymmetric environment in terms of passing along information about inflation to lots of voters, and there's lots of voters who aren't particularly cost pressured, right? Like they have more than enough money to pay an extra 20 cents per eggs, but they really, really hate inflation because they get that signal from their partisan news networks. So I think that does play a role here, and I imagine that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris would have fared a little better if they didn't have that partisan news ecosystem that's asymmetric and stacked against them. But look, like 10% inflation rate is still going to doom the incumbent party. So
Right.
I wouldn't have imagined necessarily the outcome to change. Today, what that means, right? What that means is that it's going to take a little bit longer for there to be a backlash against Trump than there was against Biden, even if you have the same inflation rate. Maybe that's how it should be, and Joe Biden was unfairly punished and Trump's getting a fair shake. I don't think so. I think it's more like there's a whole media ecosystem that's covering for the president of the United States because they have an interest in him staying in power. So, look, we'll see. Like, I don't think we're going to get a 10% inflation rate. It might be more like 5%, but people already hate inflation. So even if it goes up to 5%, there could be some pretty severe electoral consequences for that.
This might be getting a little wonky, but I presume that the reason that the Fed is not lowering the interest rates is because we already have hot inflation, and so lowering the interest rates would make that even higher, would send that even higher. Do you presume that that's what we would see if and when when either the Fed under Jerome Powell or Trump's replacement, if we get to that point, decides to lower the interest rates, that we'll see inflation rates surge even higher? And wouldn't that be, if that is what happens, wouldn't that be completely antithetical to what the incumbent party would want, given what we just saw happen in November of 2024?
Yeah, this is the tricky part about being Jerome Powell. This is the hard thing about being the Fed, is you have a dual mandate. You want to keep inflation down, but you also want to keep the job market healthy. So, if we get to the point where interest rates are making it hard for companies to hire, they need to take on debt to hire new people in a lot of cases, or there's just not enough money moving around in the economy, so these companies are having a hard time paying new employees, then they got to decrease the interest rate to get that money moving again. And that means inflation might go up a little bit. And they're constantly making that recalculation. It looks like there will be interest rate cuts later this year. They just haven't happened yet. The market is definitely pricing in, I think, like 50 basis points, 0.5% of an interest rate cut this year. So I do expect we'll see it. It's not going to be enough for Donald Trump. He's still going to want that interest rate to be 2% instead of 4.5 or 5%. But I guess that's a job for Jerome Powell, not for me.
If you're a Democratic operative looking at the polling right now, what numbers spark your interest, and what do you look to exploit as we head toward this next election cycle? Because I know that there's a marked difference between, okay, let's talk about something because it's in the news and it's a juicy story, but it may not move people at all, versus, this may not get a lot of attention, maybe the economic stuff, but clearly we've just gone through an entire election where the economic numbers and inflation have a massive impact, even if they're the fifth or sixth or seventh biggest story in the country.
Yeah, the biggest story to voters is still jobs and inflation. That's the thing that Democrats want to exploit. It's a very easy narrative. The president has been out there saying he's going to pass all these new tariffs. It's going to increase prices, but he said that this will be short-term pain necessary for America's national security. He said the phrase short-term pain to people.
Yeah.
I think that's very exploitable by the Democrats. Just say like, it's not producing the desired goal, which is right to onshore manufacturing here in the United States. We're losing manufacturing jobs and prices are going up. This is a pretty obvious L in terms of policy for the president. Yeah. So I would probably be exploiting that, especially again, because it's the number one issue to voters. The other thing is we're seeing a resurgence in civil rights and civil liberties as they're important to people in America. That makes sense, I think, given everything that's happening with you mentioned troops being deployed to cities. That's one aspect of it. I think the immigration enforcement, especially deportations, has gone too far for the average American. So they see that as a civil rights infraction too. And there's some ground for Democrats to persuade on that issue, but I would expect the bulk of their messaging is going to be on inflation and jobs.
And the flip side of that question, if you're a Republican operative and you're looking at the numbers right now, what gives you some hope? What are Trump and Republicans going to be leaning on based on the polling moving forward?
So the strongest issue for Republicans is still immigration. They're underwater, but that is their strongest issue. You want to fight on your strongest issue. So, if you ask people, do you approve of how the president is handling deportations or immigration in general? About 45% say yes, 52% say no, they don't approve. If you ask them, for example, do you support how the president's handling border security or tackling crime? Then people start to be more forgiving of the incumbent party. They'll say they approve at slightly higher rates than they say they disapprove. So I imagine we'll get a lot of focus on border security. I live in Washington, D.C., so I see the Border Patrol agents walking around here filming TikToks. Weird. I imagine we're going to see a heck of a lot more of that as the election kicks up, too. It's just weird that national law enforcement is doing like social media videos. This is strange.
Yeah. Well, this is the dystopian hellscape that we enjoy now. Elliot, as always, thank you so much for your time. Highly recommend for anybody who's watching right now, if you are interested in this kind of data analysis, please subscribe to Strength in Numbers. I'm going to put the link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. It is a great resource that I use every single week, and it's a great way to support independent media as well. So again, links on the screen and also in the post description. Elliot, thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me here, Brian.